December 7, 1943. 32,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, Staff Sergeant Thomas "Mad Tom" Callahan sat hunched behind the twin 50 caliber machine guns in the tail position of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, watching 9 Japanese Zero fighters spiral upward toward his formation like angry hornets. The other gunners in the bomber group had been tracking these aircraft for 3 minutes, fingers twitching on triggers, waiting for them to enter effective range. Callahan, however, had his guns pointed in completely the wrong direction, aimed at empty sky off the port side, his body twisted in what appeared to be the most disadvantageous position imaginable for the coming fight. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened in the next 4 minutes would transform Thomas Callahan from the laughingstock of the 500th Bombardment Group into the most studied aerial gunner in the Pacific Theater, and his seemingly insane tactics would become required teaching at every gunnery school from California to Queensland. Thomas Callahan had arrived in the Pacific 6 months earlier with a reputation that preceded him like a bad smell. During training at Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, he had consistently scored in the bottom third of his class for conventional gunnery. His instructors noted that he seemed unable to follow standard deflection shooting protocols, the basic mathematics that allowed gunners to lead their targets properly. Where other students learned to calculate angle, speed, and distance with increasing precision, Callahan appeared to operate on some incomprehensible internal logic that produced wildly inconsistent results. What those instructors had failed to notice was that Callahan was not struggling with deflection shooting. He was deliberately ignoring it, testing something else entirely. The son of a Michigan carnival shooting gallery operator, Callahan had grown up watching people aim at moving targets. His father had taught him a curious principle that governed the carnival games. Most people aimed where the target was, not where it would be, and their brains could not be easily retrained. The successful shooters, his father observed, were those who developed an instinctive feel for the timing of the shot rather than conscious calculation. They fired when it felt right, letting muscle memory and pattern recognition take over from mathematics. In the cramped tail gunner position of the B-17 called Pacific Wanderer, Callahan had spent his first 20 missions testing a radical theory. While other gunners tracked approaching fighters with steady movements, trying to maintain a smooth lead on their targets, Callahan did something different. He would aim his guns at empty air where no enemy plane currently existed, then wait with supernatural stillness until his instincts told him to fire. His crewmates thought he had lost his mind. During their 15th mission, after Callahan had fired a 3-second burst into apparently vacant sky only to have a Zero fly directly into his tracers 2 seconds later, the aircraft commander, Captain Raymond Devereaux, had seriously considered having him evaluated for combat fatigue. Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, the top turret gunner and unofficial voice of the enlisted crew, had been more direct. After that mission, as they climbed down from the aircraft at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Webb had grabbed Callahan by his flight suit. "You trying to get us all sent home in boxes?" Webb demanded, his voice tight with fury. "You fire when there's a target, not at ghosts. That's day one stuff, Mad Tom, day one." Callahan had simply smiled, that infuriating grin that made him look like he knew something nobody else did. "How many did I hit?" he had asked quietly. Webb had released him, frustration evident in every line of his body. "That's not the point. You got lucky. Tomorrow your luck runs out, and we're all depending on guns that aren't pointed at the enemy." But Callahan's luck had not run out. Mission after mission, his seemingly random bursts of fire found their marks with increasing frequency. By their 30th mission, he had more confirmed hits than any other gunner in the crew, yet nobody could explain how he was doing it, and that made them nervous. The military mind does not trust what it cannot quantify. On this December morning, as 9 Zeros climbed toward the bomber formation, Callahan was about to demonstrate his method in a way that would make it impossible to ignore. The Japanese fighters had launched from Rabaul 40 minutes earlier, part of a reinforced squadron assigned to intercept the American bombers, targeting Japanese shipping in New Britain. The lead pilot, a veteran named Takeshi Yamamoto, with 11 American aircraft to his credit, had chosen a classic approach vector. His fighters would climb to altitude, position themselves above and behind the bomber formation, then dive through in a coordinated attack that would give the American gunners minimal time to track and fire. It was a sound tactic, proven effective dozens of times. What Yamamoto did not know was that Thomas Callahan had been studying this exact approach pattern for 6 months, timing the intervals, measuring the angles, building an internal map of how these attacks developed. Inside Pacific Wanderer, Captain Devereaux watched the Zeros climbing and felt the familiar tension coil in his stomach. His bomber was flying in the vulnerable number 3 position of the second element, a spot that typically drew concentrated fire during stern attacks. He clicked on the intercom, his voice professionally calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Gunners, we have 9 bandits climbing to altitude off our 6 o'clock high. Estimate 2 minutes to engagement range. Check your systems and remember your training. Fire discipline, gentlemen. Short bursts, lead your targets." From his tail position, Callahan acknowledged the order with a single word, then did something that made Webb, watching from the top turret, curse into his oxygen mask. Callahan swiveled his twin 50s to face not back toward the approaching fighters, but to the left side of the aircraft, his guns aimed at a point in space approximately 30 degrees off the tail and slightly high. Then he sat completely still, hands on the grips, fingers on the triggers, staring at empty sky with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse hole. Webb's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp with anger. "Callahan, what are you doing? Enemy fighters approaching from 6 o'clock and you're aiming at nothing. Get your guns on target now." Callahan did not respond. He was counting in his head, a rhythm he had perfected over 30 missions. The Zeros would climb for another 45 seconds, then level off. They would circle for approximately 20 seconds, the lead pilot making final assessments and issuing commands. Then they would roll into their attack dives, 9 aircraft converging on the bomber formation from slightly different angles to overwhelm the defensive fire. Standard procedure called for the tail gunner to track the fighters during their approach, then engage when they entered effective range at approximately 800 yards. By that point, the fighters would be diving at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, their approach angles constantly changing. Even with proper deflection shooting, hitting a target under those conditions required exceptional skill and considerable luck. Callahan had realized something during his months of study. The mathematics worked, but the human brain could not perform those calculations fast enough during the actual engagement. By the time a gunner saw a fighter, calculated its vector, established lead and fired, the fighter had already altered its position. The gunner was always shooting at where the target had been, not where it would be. But what if you could predict not just where one fighter would be, but where all of them would be? What if you could identify the pattern they would follow before they followed it? Captain Devereaux watched his watch, counting down. The formation maintained its steady course toward the target, 15 B-17s in staggered elements, their combined defensive fire theoretically capable of creating an impenetrable zone of destruction around the group. Theoretically. In practice, fighters diving through at high speed often made it through that zone with minimal damage, especially if they attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The Japanese fighters reached their attack altitude and leveled off. Through his binoculars, Devereaux could see them forming up, preparing for their coordinated dive. His hand tightened on the control yoke. These were the seconds that separated successful missions from disaster, the moment when training, equipment, and luck all collided in violent confusion. In the tail position, Callahan whispered numbers to himself, a quiet countdown that matched the rhythm he had memorized. 5, 4, 3. The Japanese fighters rolled into their dives, 9 aircraft arrowing down toward the bomber formation like falling knives. 2, 1. Callahan's fingers tightened on the triggers, his guns still aimed at apparently empty sky. Webb's voice exploded over the intercom. "Callahan, they're diving! Get your guns around!" Callahan fired. The twin 50 caliber machine guns roared to life, sending a 3-second burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds through a point in space that appeared to contain nothing but air. The tracers arced away from the bomber in a tight stream, marking a path through the December sky. Then the first Zero flew directly into that stream, the fighter had rolled into its dive from the high port side, beginning a curving approach that would bring it down through the bomber formation from left to right. At the exact moment, it intersected the point where Callahan had aimed his guns. His rounds tore through the aircraft's engine, cowling and wing root. The Zero shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine, and fell away in a spiraling dive. But Callahan was not watching his first target. Before the Zero had even begun its death spiral, he had shifted his aim to another point in empty sky, perhaps 20 degrees to the right of his first position, and fired again. The second Zero flew into his tracers 4 seconds later. This fighter took hits along its fuselage and tail section, the armor-piercing rounds punching through the lightweight aluminum structure as if it were paper. The aircraft's tail surfaces shredded under the impact, and the Zero flipped inverted, entering an uncontrolled tumble toward the ocean far below. Webb, watching from the top turret, stopped breathing for a moment. What he was witnessing violated everything he understood about aerial gunnery. Callahan was not tracking targets. He was not leading them or calculating deflection. He was simply firing at points in space, and enemy fighters were flying into his fire as if drawn there by invisible wires. Callahan shifted his aim again, this time to a point almost directly behind the bomber, and fired a longer burst. The third Zero appeared in his tracers 3 seconds later, taking hits across its cockpit and forward fuselage. The fighter's canopy shattered, and the aircraft nosed over into a steep dive, trailing debris. The remaining Japanese pilots, suddenly aware that something catastrophic was happening to their formation, broke their attack pattern. This was a mistake. In breaking pattern, they became predictable in a different way. Fighters that deviated from their planned approach had limited options. Physics and tactics dictated where they could go, the angles they could adopt, the speeds they could maintain. Callahan had studied these patterns too. He swiveled his guns to the right side, aimed high, and waited. 2 Zeros, attempting to circle for another approach, entered his kill zone within seconds of each other. Callahan's burst caught the first fighter in the wing, severing the aileron control surfaces. The aircraft rolled uncontrollably and collided with its wingman, and both fighters tumbled toward the sea in a tangle of wreckage. 5 down in less than 20 seconds, the remaining 4 Japanese pilots, witnessing their squadron being systematically destroyed by what appeared to be supernatural gunnery, made the decision to break off the attack. They dove away from the bomber formation, seeking the safety of lower altitude and distance. Callahan tracked one of the fleeing Zeros, leading it perfectly now that it was flying a straight line away from the bomber. His burst caught the fighter in the engine, and it began trailing black smoke. The pilot struggled with the controls for a few seconds before the aircraft rolled onto its back and began its final dive. The last 3 Zeros escaped, disappearing into cloud cover at 15,000 feet. The intercom remained silent for several seconds, every crew member processing what they had just witnessed. Then Webb's voice, sounding shaken, broke the silence. "Skipper, did you see that? Callahan he just... Captain Devereaux, his hands slightly unsteady on the controls, clicked his mic. "I saw it, Webb. I saw all of it. Callahan, you still with us back there?" Callahan's voice came back calm and steady, as if he had just completed a routine training exercise. "Still here, Captain. 6 confirmed, looks like. Maybe 7 if that last one does not make it home." Devereaux shook his head, knowing none of his crew could see the gesture. "Callahan, when we land, you and I need to have a very long conversation about what just happened, because I have been flying combat missions for 8 months, and I have never seen anything like that." The formation continued toward its target, completing the mission without further incident. But word of Callahan's performance spread through the radio channels like wildfire. By the time Pacific Wanderer touched down at Henderson Field 3 hours later, half the base had heard some version of the story, each telling more incredible than the last. In the debriefing room, Captain Devereaux provided his account to the intelligence officers, his voice still carrying an edge of disbelief. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Callahan, engaged 9 enemy fighters during a coordinated attack on our formation. He achieved 6 confirmed downings, possibly 7, in approximately 30 seconds of engagement time. His ammunition expenditure was roughly 300 rounds. Those are the facts as I observed them. The intelligence officer, a major named Harrison, who had heard countless combat reports, looked up from his notes. 300 rounds for 6 confirmed. Sergeant, the average ammunition expenditure for a confirmed hit in this theater is approximately 1,500 rounds. Are you certain about these numbers? Devereaux nodded firmly. I am certain, sir, and there is something else you need to understand. Callahan was not engaging in conventional gunnery. He was firing at points in space before the enemy aircraft reached those points. He was predicting their flight paths with such precision that they flew directly into his fire. Major Harrison set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. Captain, that is not possible. The deflection calculations required for that kind of shooting cannot be performed in real time, especially not during the stress of combat. Even our best gunners need to track their targets visually and adjust their fire continuously. From his position near the wall, where he had been waiting nervously for his turn to provide testimony, Callahan spoke up. His voice was respectful but confident. Permission to speak, sir. Harrison gestured for him to continue. Callahan stepped forward, his words careful and measured. Major, you are correct that the mathematics cannot be performed in real time. That is why I do not try to perform them. Instead, I study the patterns. Every Japanese fighter squadron in this theater uses similar tactics because those tactics work. They climb to altitude, position themselves advantageously, then execute coordinated diving attacks from predictable vectors. Once you understand the patterns they must follow, you can predict where they will be at any given moment. Harrison frowned, intrigued despite his skepticism. You are saying you memorized attack patterns? Callahan shook his head. Not memorized, sir. Internalized. It is similar to how a musician learns to play an instrument. At first, they think about every note, every finger position, but eventually the movements become automatic. They do not think about playing, they just play. I have fired my guns in combat enough times that I no longer think about deflection shooting or lead calculations. I simply know where the fighters will be, and I fire when my instincts tell me the timing is right. Webb, who had been listening from the other side of the room, spoke up. Major, I have been flying with Callahan for 30 missions, and I thought he was crazy. We all did. But I watched what he did today, and sir, I have never seen anything like it. He was not lucky, he knew exactly what he was doing. Major Harrison spent the next hour questioning Callahan in detail, trying to understand the mechanics of his method. Other officers joined the debriefing, including the group commander, Colonel James Pritchard, who had heard the reports and wanted to assess whether Callahan's technique could be taught to other gunners. Callahan did his best to explain his process, but he struggled to articulate something that had become instinctive. When I watch enemy fighters approach, I see the attack developing in my mind before it happens in reality. I know the angles they prefer, the altitudes they favor, the timing they use. I position my guns where I believe they will be, not where they are, and I wait until the moment feels right to fire. If I try to think about it consciously, I fail. I have to trust the pattern recognition my brain has developed. Colonel Pritchard listened carefully, then asked the question that everyone in the room wanted answered. Can you teach this to others? Callahan considered the question for a long moment before answering. I honestly do not know, sir. I have been doing this my entire life, growing up in my father's shooting gallery, learning to see patterns in motion, understanding timing and rhythm rather than mathematics. I think other gunners could learn some aspects of it, but it would require them to unlearn much of their conventional training first. That might not be possible for everyone. The discussion continued late into the evening, but eventually, Colonel Pritchard made a decision. Callahan would be temporarily reassigned from combat operations to work with the training command at the gunnery school in Port Moresby. He would spend the next 2 months attempting to develop a curriculum that could teach other gunners his pattern recognition approach. The experiment produced mixed results. Some gunners, particularly those with backgrounds in sports or activities requiring anticipatory skills, showed improvement when taught to recognize and predict attack patterns. Others found the method incomprehensible, unable to abandon the mathematical precision they had been trained to rely upon. The military establishment, uncomfortable with techniques that could not be standardized and quantified, ultimately decided that Callahan's approach should be taught as a supplementary skill rather than a replacement for conventional gunnery training. But the legend of Mad Tom Callahan spread throughout the Pacific theater. Gunners who heard the story began paying more attention to enemy attack patterns, looking for predictability in what had seemed like chaos. Some developed their own versions of Callahan's technique, adapting his core principle of pattern recognition to their own cognitive styles. Callahan himself returned to combat operations after his training assignment ended, flying another 40 missions with Pacific Wanderer before the war ended. His final tally was 23 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, with another 11 probably destroyed, making him one of the highest-scoring enlisted gunners in the Pacific theater. His ammunition efficiency remained extraordinary throughout his combat career, averaging less than 800 rounds per confirmed hit, compared to the theater average of over 2,000 rounds. After the war ended, Callahan returned to Michigan and took over his father's Carnival shooting gallery. He rarely spoke about his combat experience, preferring to let his wartime achievements remain in the past. But on his wall, in a simple frame, hung a letter from Colonel Pritchard, written in 1945, shortly before Pritchard rotated back to the United States. The letter read, in part, "Sergeant Callahan, your unconventional methods challenged everything we thought we understood about aerial gunnery. You forced us to recognize that there are different forms of expertise, and that sometimes the most effective techniques cannot be reduced to formulas and procedures. You trusted your instincts when everyone around you insisted you were wrong. And you proved that genuine mastery comes not from following rules, but from understanding the deeper patterns those rules attempt to describe. The men who flew with you owe you their lives. The service owes you recognition for expanding our understanding of what is possible." Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, who survived the war and remained in contact with Callahan for decades afterward, often reflected on that December day when his crewmate had done the impossible. In an interview conducted for a military history project in 1983, Webb said, "We called him Mad Tom because we thought he was crazy. Turns out he was crazy like a fox. He saw things the rest of us could not see, understood things we did not understand. I watched him take down 9 Japanese fighters in 30 seconds, and I still cannot fully explain how he did it. Some people just operate on a different level, you know. They process information differently, see patterns where others see randomness. Tom was one of those people. I am just grateful he was on our side." The military's official analysis of Callahan's technique, completed in 1946, concluded that his success stemmed from an unusual combination of natural talent, extensive practice, and cognitive processing that favored pattern recognition over conscious calculation. The report noted that while his methods could not be universally taught, the underlying principle that human intuition could sometimes outperform mathematical precision in complex, dynamic situations had broader implications for military training across multiple specialties. In the decades that followed, researchers studying expertise and skill acquisition would cite Callahan's case as an example of what they termed expert intuition, the ability of highly experienced practitioners to make accurate decisions without conscious deliberation. His technique demonstrated that in certain domains, particularly those involving complex patterns and rapid response requirements, the unconscious mind could process information more effectively than conscious analysis. The Japanese pilot, Takeshi Yamamoto, who led the attack that Callahan had so devastatingly disrupted, survived the war and later provided his own account of that December day. In his memoir, published in Tokyo in 1971, he wrote, "We approached the American bomber formation with confidence, having executed similar attacks many times before. But on this day, we encountered something we had never experienced. Before we could even engage properly, our aircraft were being struck down as if the American gunner could see into the future. It was as if he knew where we would be before we arrived there. 3 of my most experienced pilots were lost in seconds. I have never felt such helplessness in combat, such certainty that we were facing something beyond our ability to counter. We withdrew not because we were cowards, but because we recognized we were facing a phenomenon we did not understand and could not defeat." The 9 Zeros that attacked Pacific Wanderer that day represented a loss rate that Japanese forces in the Pacific could not sustain. Each aircraft had required approximately 6,000 hours of labor to produce, along with resources that Japan's shrinking industrial capacity could barely spare. Each pilot had received training that took months and consumed fuel that the Empire desperately needed for other operations. The destruction of 6 aircraft and pilots in 30 seconds represented not just a tactical defeat, but a glimpse of the fundamental imbalance that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. American industrial capacity could replace both aircraft and crews faster than they could be destroyed. Japanese capacity could not. Every loss hurt more, constrained operations more severely, reduced future capabilities more dramatically. Callahan's extraordinary efficiency that day was, in a larger sense, simply an extreme example of the advantage that American forces enjoyed throughout the Pacific Campaign. But for the men who flew with Thomas Callahan, who watched him perform what seemed like magic with twin 50-caliber machine guns, the broader strategic implications mattered less than the simple fact that he had kept them alive. In a war where bomber crews faced some of the highest casualty rates of any combat personnel, where each mission carried a significant chance of not returning, having someone like Callahan in the tail position meant measurably better odds of survival. Captain Raymond Devereaux, in his own post-war reflections, put it most simply, "Callahan saved my life and the lives of my crew more times than I can count. He did it by being willing to trust himself when everyone else told him he was wrong, by developing skills through methods that made no sense to military trainers, by seeing patterns that should have been invisible. The military teaches us to follow procedures, to trust the system, to believe that proper training and correct execution will produce victory. Callahan taught me that sometimes you need someone who thinks differently, who sees differently, who operates by rules that cannot be written down in training manuals. War is too complex, too chaotic, to be fully reduced to procedures. Sometimes you need someone who can navigate that chaos by instinct." We were fortunate to have such a person with us. The story of Thomas Callahan and his unconventional gunnery technique remains a subject of study in military training institutions, not because his specific methods can be universally applied, but because his success challenges assumptions about expertise, training, and performance under pressure. In an organization built on standardization and replicable procedures, Callahan demonstrated that exceptional individual talent operating by non-standard methods could sometimes produce results that standard training could not match. The deeper lesson, perhaps, is that effective organizations must find ways to recognize and accommodate different forms of expertise, even when those forms do not fit neatly into established frameworks. Callahan's crewmates initially rejected his methods because they looked wrong, violated training doctrine, and could not be easily explained or justified. Only his demonstrated results eventually forced them to accept that his approach, however unconventional, was legitimate and effective. In the end, the tail gunner who everyone thought was insane proved to be one of the sanest people in the sky that December day. While others relied on training that could not fully prepare them for the chaos of aerial combat, Callahan relied on skills developed over a lifetime, pattern recognition abilities honed to a razor's edge, and the courage to trust his instincts even when everyone around him insisted he was wrong. His turn brought down 9 Japanese Zeros, 6 confirmed in the span of 30 seconds, and his technique kept his crew alive through 70 missions in one of the most dangerous theaters of the war. The twin 50-caliber machine guns he used that day are now in a military museum, mounted in a preserved tail section of a B-17. A small plaque describes Staff Sergeant Thomas Callahan's service record and his extraordinary gunnery achievements. But the plaque cannot capture the full story of a man who saw patterns where others saw only chaos, who developed mastery through intuition rather than mathematics, and who proved that sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones that work best. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.